Tanganyika was a territory in East Africa. Today is now known as Tanzania. A bizarre epidemic started in a girls' boarding school in Kahash, a city in the northwest part of the territory. Over the next 48 days, 95 of the 59 students of the girls' boarding school suffered from uncontrollable fits of laughter and crying. It started with 3 girls at the school and then spread to others. The fits lasted anywhere from a few hours to 16 days. The average was 7 days. After the initial epidemic, there was a recurrence weeks later. Between May 21, 1962 and June 31, 1962, 57 students suffered from uncontrollable fits of laughter. During the fits, the children were also restless and would do things like run around aimlessly. Some children even got violent. Also, the laughter led to some children fainting. Some also developed rashes and respiratory issues. Finally, some also had uncontrollable flatulence. Some people were laughing so much that they couldn't sleep. If they did fall asleep, they woke up laughing. Eventually, the laughter spread to different villages and infected around 1,000 people. Things got to be so bad that 14 schools were closed. It's unclear how long the epidemic lasted. Several reports say it lasted at least 6 months, but others say it possibly lasted as long as 30 months. Some people have written about the epidemic, think it was harmless and even a joyful epidemic. However, most people who were inflicted were deeply distressed about their condition. Researchers looked for environmental causes for the laughter, but found nothing. Some people also thought there could be a virus, but nothing was found that explained why the people were laughing uncontrollably. Linguistic professor Dr. Christian F. Heppelman at Texas A&M University believes the epidemic is an example of mass psychogenic illness, also known as sociogenic illness. Mass psychogenic illness happens to people in high-stress situations who can't extract themselves. Their bodies are desperately looking for a physical release of the stress, and in this case, it was laughter. Studies have shown that laughter can reduce stress and increase endorphins, which relieve pain and improve mood. When the epidemic started, it was a stressful time in Tanganyika. Less than a month earlier, Tanganyika had gained independence from Britain, and the new country's future was uncertain. It's also important to note that it started in a Catholic girls' boarding school. The students may have been more stressed because they were separated from their families. The girls were also in their pre-teens and teen years, which can be a stressful time in one's life. They may have also felt conflicted learning about Western values and Catholicism for the first time. One major question is, why did the laughter spread? It's because people share beliefs about potential environmental triggers. For example, someone may feel sick because they smell something odd and hear a rumor about a toxin in the area. They ask other people if they smell something or have they heard about the toxin and if they are feeling well. Some people they talk to may start to experience the same symptoms, but in reality, there's no toxin making people sick. This is what happens in cases of mass psychogenic illness. In this case, the people of Tanganyika started laughing and couldn't stop. George Archer Ty stood before 120 of his colleagues in the London, Ontario auditorium and took a deep breath. Dr. Ty had a fascinating case to bring before his gathering of the Canada Medical Association, and he wasn't quite sure how it would be received. The case was bizarre to say the least, unbelievable to say the most. But Dr. Ty was a well-respected physician in his hometown of Thamesville, Ontario. He was an army surgeon, the local coroner, a town councillor, a school trustee. One author called him, quote, beyond all question, one of Ontario's greatest physicians, unquote. Those who knew him knew he wasn't given to flights of fancy. And so armed with his reputation and the facts, Dr. Tai took a deep breath and began his presentation. 2 years before, in the summer of 1877, the good doctor was called to the small town of Rodney, Ontario, near the shore of Lake Erie. A 17-year-old girl named Caroline Clare was bedridden and lethargic, and no one knew why. Scores of doctors had examined and tested her, but no one could put a finger on what was wrong. Caroline wasn't eating anymore. She had shed 43 pounds from her 130-pound frame. She slept all the time, and when she wasn't sleeping, she was hallucinating, babbling about far-off places, wondrous, beautiful places she had never seen or even read about. Then, after 18 months confined to her bed, Caroline took a turn for the better, and the better. Soon, until she was sitting up in bed and laughing with her friends and 6 siblings. Then one day, Caroline's younger sister brought her 2 corsets she had been mending while Caroline was bedridden. Smiling proudly, the sister handed one of the corsets to Caroline. Then her sister screamed at the top of her lungs, falling to the floor and writhing in agony. It felt like someone had run a needle into my finger, the sister said afterwards. Doctors discovered that the corset had a metal insert that seemed to have closed some kind of electrical circuit, shocking the sister. Stranger still, Caroline demonstrated that when she picked up a metal spoon to eat, it stuck to her hand, to the point where her father, Richard, had to physically pry it off. In an experiment, the doctor brought in a box of sewing needles and watched in awe as they jumped from the box to Caroline's left hand, covering her skin like a kind of metal armor. The needles then had to be taken off one by one. The doctor then presented Caroline with a compass, and she made the needle inside spin with a flick of a finger. Dad Richard soon noticed that the family dog would sleep for hours at the foot of Caroline's bed. Not just sleeping, but almost unconscious. Motionless, he said, as if in death. When Caroline approached her infant sibling, the baby would scream to high heavens. However, as she rested a hand on the child, it calmed instantly and went back to sleep. Word got out around the town of Rodney, and soon scores of locals were lined up outside the Clare farmhouse on Concession Road 2, hoping to get a glimpse of this otherwise unremarkable girl with remarkable powers of magnetism. Soon, Dr. Nye reported, Caroline began to be able to control her ability, which seemed to have concentrated in her left hand. By rubbing her wrist and forearm with her left arm, the magnetic charge seemed to dissipate, allowing her to drop objects that became stuck to her. Still, Caroline was forced to eat with wooden utensils, Dr. Tai said as he concluded his speech, presumably for the rest of her life. The first set of twins is incredibly famous, and many would believe that they are so in sync that they make perfect harmonies together. They are Robin and Maurice Gibb, 2 of the 3 members of the band the Bee Gees. They were in the band with their older brother, Barry, and they released songs that included How Can You Mend a Broken Heart and To Love Somebody. However, their biggest album is arguably Saturday Night Fever, which was released in 1977 and was the soundtrack to the film of the same name starring John Travolta. The Bee Gees were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1997. Obviously, Robin and Maurice were connected through music, but they were also connected through their twin power. During one major event, one of the biggest events of a person's life, the 2 shared an intense connection. This is when 53-year-old Maurice was having an operation to remove an intestinal blockage. During the operation, he had a heart attack. Even though Maurice was in Miami and Robin was in London, Robin reported that he had stomach pain himself at the same time that Maurice was in pain. It was like he could feel what Maurice was feeling, and he shared his pain at that moment. Robin said that previously he had never had stomach pain similar to what he felt that day. When the family received word that Maurice's life was in the balance, Robin hopped on a flight from London to Miami to be there for him. Even though Maurice was in critical condition, He held on until Robin arrived. Robin's flight was even an hour late leaving the United Kingdom, yet Maurice waited. So when Maurice passed away, he had his twin next to him. The family believes that Maurice was waiting for Robin to get there. While this situation is incredibly sad, it may have saved Robin's life. When Robin was 60 years old, he was having stomach pain, and he was encouraged by his wife to get it checked out immediately. When he did, the doctors wanted to send him home, but his wife insisted that they investigate further. She was worried that Robin would endure the same fate as his twin brother. It's lucky that she insisted, because it turned out that he had the same intestinal blockage that Maurice had when he had his operation, but because they caught it sooner, Robin was able to survive. So it looks like Maurice's experience gave Robin some extra time. Robin Gibb ultimately died in 2012 at the age of 62. The first signs were subtle: a restless night here, a little fatigue there. Most people would dismiss it as stress or too much coffee. But for families like the Webbs of Australia or the historic Italian kindred that brought the condition to light, sleeplessness was never just sleeplessness. It was the opening note of a death sentence. In the late 1700s, in the Veneto region of northern Italy, a wealthy man began to suffer strange symptoms. He was in his 50s when his nights became disturbed by vivid dreams and waking terrors. Soon he could not sleep at all. His balance faltered, his mind slipped into confusion, and within months he was dead. His family buried him quietly, but the curse did not die with him. Generation after generation, members of this Italian lineage developed the same disease, always between middle age and old age, always progressing the same way. Doctors eventually gave it a name: fatal familial insomnia. Unlike other ordinary insomnia, FFI is not psychological nor environmental. It's genetic, embedded in the DNA. The culprit is a mutation in the PRNP gene, which produces a protein called a pyron. Pyrons are unlike any other disease agent. They are misfolded proteins, capable of infecting normal proteins and twisting them into the same disease shape. In FFI, the pyrons accumulate in a small but vital region of the brain, the thalamus, which regulates the sleep-wake cycle. As the thalamus deteriorates, sleep becomes impossible. No sedative, no anesthetic, no amount of exhaustion can force the brain into slumber. The timeline of FFI is cruel but predictable. Stage 1 occurs for the first 4 months. The patient develops insomnia, anxiety, and vivid dreamlike hallucinations. Their nights are restless and exhaustion mounts. Stage 2 happens in months 5 to 9. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. Panic attacks and hallucinations intensify. The body begins to break down. Stage 3 occurs in months 10 to 12. The patient enters a twilight state of dementia. Speech falters, coordination is lost, and memory collapses. The last stage happens after the first year. Finally, the body slips into a coma before death. Life expectancy from the first symptoms rarely exceeds 2 years. In the 2010s, Australians began hearing the story of Lachlan Webb. His family had been haunted by sleeplessness for generations. He watched his mother and uncles die of FFI decades earlier. His sister Haley and himself had genetic testing to see if they had FFI. Unfortunately, they both carry the gene mutation. Fearing for her child's future, they turned to IVF with genetic screening, ensuring that their baby would not inherit the fatal mutation. Haley said in interviews, quote, "The cycle stops here," unquote. By 2002, Lachlan had a boy named Morrison with his wife, Claire. In 2023, the day after celebrating his son's birthday, Lachlan Webb received a devastating diagnosis. Fatal familial insomnia had begun. Following his diagnosis in April 2023, Lachlan had a rapid decline. He experienced memory fog, dizziness, weight loss, and frequent night wakings, symptoms easily misattributed to stress or new parenthood. Within months, his condition worsened. He became wheelchair-bound, started losing his balance and coordination, and suffered memory and speech difficulties. Unlike previous family members, Lachlan's mental and emotional symptoms progressed more slowly, and remarkably, he did not experience hallucinations at that stage. Lachlan passed away on November 5, 2024, just 2 weeks after his 37th birthday, leaving his wife Claire and their young son, Morrison. Across the ocean, in the United States, another story was unfolding. Sonia Valab was 27 when her mother died suddenly of an unknown neurological disease. An autopsy revealed the truth: fatal familial insomnia. Genetic testing confirmed Sonia had inherited the mutation. Faced with the knowledge that she would one day lose sleep and her life, Sonia and her husband, Eric Minkle, made an extraordinary decision. They abandoned their previous careers and became scientists, dedicating their lives to studying Pyron diseases. Today, Sonia and Eric are among the leading voices in FFI research, working at Harvard and the Broad Institute, racing against time to find treatment before Sonia's own symptoms appear. FFI is one of the rarest diseases on Earth. Only about 50 family members worldwide are known to carry it. Yet its impact is immense, not only on the patients, but on the generations who live in its shadow, wondering if they will inherit the mutation, knowing there is no cure. There is no treatment that can reverse or stop the disease. Standard sleeping pills do nothing because the brain itself has lost the ability to enter sleep. Even anesthetics often fail. The disease is, quite literally, the body's inability to rest. What makes FFI so tragic is not just its fatality, but its psychological burden. Children grow up watching parents waste away, then reach adulthood knowing they might share the same fate. Genetic testing can provide an answer, but some family members choose not to know, preferring the uncertainty to the certainty of doom. Others, like Sonia, face the truth head-on. For now, fatal familial insomnia remains incurable, a cruel reminder of how fragile the human brain is. Yet, there is hope. Research into gene slicing, pyron-blocking therapies, and even early detection tools can one day stop the disease before symptoms begin. But time is the greatest enemy. For those already showing symptoms, there is no turning back. Their nights will only grow longer, darker, and more restless until the body gives out. One afternoon in 1780, at the University of Bologna in Italy, Professor Luigi Galvani was out hunting frogs. Galvani was studying anatomy, a very popular medical field at the time, and he needed some frogs for his experiments. After collecting a few specimens, he returned to the school where his wife, Lucia, who also acted as his assistant, prepared the frogs for dissection. She handed her husband a scalpel, and he had begun to remove the frog's skin. However, the scalpel had gathered a charge of static electricity in the transfer. When Luigi touched the charged scalpel to the frog's legs, they twitched. Astounded by what had happened, he replicated the experiment, this time using metal rods instead of a scalpel. Each time an arc of electricity appeared, the frog's legs leapt to life. It was as if the frog's legs were dancing. Galvani quickly published his findings, theorizing that every living thing had an animal electricity, a kind of conducting liquid connecting nerves to muscles. But his rival, Alessandro Volta, disagreed. Volta thought that Galvani's magical results lied in the metal rods he used, not some kind of magical liquid in the animal. In order to prove Galvani wrong, he replicated the experiment and accidentally invented the battery in the process. But the scientific community of the time split on who was correct. And that seemed to be the end of the little scientific feud. Volta ended up having the term voltage named after him and the concept of a battery. Galvani died in 1798, and although the term galvanization, as in galvanized steel, is named for him, he didn't really have anything to do with that process. But Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, wanted to change his uncle's legacy. By the early 1800s, Aldini had been touring Europe, putting on a kind of traveling sideshow in which he would replicate his uncle's experiments. Ironically, using Volta's battery, he would go from town to town, reanimating dead things. In one country barn, he made a headless dog kick. In another, he made dead sheep open its eyes. But the real test of his abilities and his uncle's legacy would be to show electricity could reanimate a human corpse. And in 1803, Aldini got his chance. A year earlier, a man named George Foster had been arrested, tried, and convicted for the gruesome London murders of his wife and young daughter. Foster was publicly hanged for his crimes, but instead of being dissected to ensure he wouldn't enter an afterlife, Foster's corpse was given to Aldini. A few days later, at London's Royal College of Surgeons, dozens of doctors and scientists braved a damp and chilly January night to fill the college operating theater where they hoped to watch Aldini bring a dead man back to life. As the spectators leaned forward, Aldini connected and inserted various metal electrodes to Foster's body. Then the good doctor attached the electrodes to the battery and turned on the switch. Immediately, the muscles in Foster's face tightened and then twisted into a horrific grin. Gasps from the audience as the killer's eyes suddenly popped open. Foster's hands curled into fists and shot up into the air. Reportedly, some horrified onlookers began filing out of the theater. It's said that Aldini's own assistant suffered a heart attack during the show. Despite what was going on around him, Aldini turned up the current. Foster's body began to buck on the metal operating table. His legs kicked wildly. And then Aldini turned off the battery. The audience didn't know how to react. Some were convinced the idea of reanimating the dead was possible. Others scoffed that because Foster's heart didn't restart beating and blood didn't restart flowing, that no life was possible. Word spread of Aldini's morbid experiment all over London during the early 1800s. And that continued when he took his show on the road across Europe. Soon, Aldini became the talk of the intellectual class, including amongst a group of writers who, in a Swiss chalet in 1816, challenged each other to come up with a scary story in the course of one night. One of those writers would draw upon the newspaper accounts she read of Aldini to write a story called The Modern Prometheus, otherwise known as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The name would become synonymous with mad scientists everywhere, and all because of a dancing frog. In 2007, the peer-reviewed journal, The Lancet, published an article titled Brain of a White-Collar Worker. It was about a 44-year-old civil servant who was never identified. He lived in Marseille, France, and he was married and had 2 children. He went to the doctor because for the past 2 weeks he had felt a weakness in his left leg. The doctor looked at his records. He learned that when the man was 6 months old, he received a ventricular atrial shunt to treat hydrocephalus, a condition in which excess cerebrospinal fluid accumulates within the ventricles of the brain. is commonly known as water on the brain. When he was 14 years old, he had problems with his left leg. He had uncontrolled spasms, and at times it was weak. The shunt was removed, and the problems with his left leg went away. The doctor decided to have the man undergo CT and MRI scans. The results showed the doctors something remarkable. The man's skull was full of cerebrospinal fluid that cushions the brain, and he only had a thin layer of brain tissue. His brain was about 90% smaller than average. It was initially thought that the rest of the brain was destroyed and replaced with the fluid. But years after the article was first published, experts said that in the 30 years after the shunt was removed, the man's brain was compressed into a thin layer. Amazingly, even though 90% of his brain had been compressed, he lived a normal life. He had an IQ of 75, which is below average, but is not considered mentally disabled. The man's condition gave researchers a lot of insight into the understanding of the brain. Notably, it gave them clues about the consciousness, which is the awareness of our existence. Researchers now believe that there are several areas in the brain that are responsible for consciousness. On February 26, 2014, Coroner Dexter Howard took the body of 78-year-old Walter Williams to the Porter & Sons Funeral Home in Lexington, Mississippi. The reason he was taken is that around 9 p.m. that night, Williams didn't have a pulse. Since not having a pulse is a major sign of not being alive, there was a pretty safe assumption that Williams' time on Earth had come to an end. The paperwork regarding his death was completed, and he was on his way in a body bag to be embalmed. That's when the bag started moving, and a distinct sound of breathing came from the bag. And just like that, Walter Williams was given a second chance at life. He was very much alive and very much not dead. The coroner, Dexter Howard, claimed it was a miracle. And while they can't be completely certain as to how Williams magically came back to life, there is one fairly unmagical answer. He had a defibrillator implant under his skin on his chest. The coroner, Dexter Howard's theory is that the defibrillator jump-started his heart. Although it sounds like a good possibility, we can never quite know for sure. While some have called it a miracle, some blame Howard as a coroner for declaring him dead in the first place. They lay the blame at his feet because, while he's a coroner, he is not a doctor and does not have a medical degree. In the United States, there are over 1,500 counties in which the coroner is an elected official who is not required to have a medical degree. This has led people to think that Howard just wasn't qualified enough to declare Walter dead. Walter Williams' second shot at life was short-lived. He had about 2 more weeks on Earth to spend with family and friends before he passed away again. But he remained passed away this time. His family saw the whole event as a blessing. His nephew, Eddie Hester, said, "I think he's gone this time," in reference to his second passing. However, he refers to the 2 weeks as a 2-week miracle for me, and I enjoyed every minute of it, and my family did too. It seems that Walter Williams' family really got a sense of meaning of life through this event, and they treasured the precious time they had left as much as possible. In medicine, few conditions are as paradoxical as congenital insensitivity to pain, also known as CIP. On the surface, it sounds like a blessing, living without pain. But in practice, it's a dangerous and life-altering genetic disorder. The first scattered reports of children who could not feel pain appeared in the 1930s to 1950s, often from doctors puzzled by young patients with severe injuries but no complaints of pain. In 1963, a British physician named C.J. Dearborn published one of the earliest documented medical case reports of congenital indifference to pain. Through the 1970s and 1980s, more structured studies classified pain loss conditions. Patients were found to differ. Some couldn't sweat, some lost temperature sensations, and others lost only pain sensation. In the 1990s, the advances in nerve biopsy showed that many children with CIP had absent or severely reduced small diameter pain fibers, which normally carry danger signals to the brain. This was the first step toward linking the condition to genetics. One of the first widely studied cases came from Pakistan in the early 2000s. A boy from Lahore became known for his daredevil acts as a street performer. He could walk on hot coals, drive knives into his arms, and even jump from the rooftop to the ground. He never flinched. Crowds called him fearless, but behind the spectacle was tragedy. The boy was suffering from a mutation in the SCNA9A gene, which prevented his nerves from transmitting pain signals. The boy died before his teenage years from injuries he never realized were fatal. The case was published in medical journals and became a cornerstone in understanding the biology of pain. The SCN9A mutation is the most common cause of CIP. It disables the NaV 1.7 sodium channel in nerve cells, essentially cutting the wire between the body and the brain. Without this signal, cuts, burns, fractures, and infections can occur silently. Often children present with bent tongues, unnoticed fractures, and repeated injuries simply because they never felt the warning signals others rely on to survive. Other genes can cause the condition. NTRK1 mutations lead to hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy type 4, also known as HSAN4. Patients with this condition cannot feel pain and cannot sweat, which can be fatal in hot climates. PRDM12 mutations block the development of pain-sensing neurons during embryonic growth. A rare ZFHX2 mutation was discovered in the Marcelli family of Italy in 2017. Several family members could still sense heat and pressure, but had dramatically reduced sensitivity to pain. The unusual biology drew international scientific attention. For patients, the daily reality of CIP is complex. Parents of children with the condition often perform routine body checks looking for bruises, infections, or burns. Protective gear is common, as kids may unknowingly injure themselves during play. Many develop early arthritis from walking on untreated fractures. Others suffer severe complications from undiagnosed infections. Some live relatively long lives with constant medical supervision. Others, like the boy in Pakistan, do not survive childhood. Yet these tragedies have given rise to breakthroughs. By studying people with CIP, scientists have identified NaV 1.7 sodium channels as crucial targets for pain perception. Pharmaceutical companies are now developing NaV 1.7 inhibitors in the hopes of creating non-addictive painkillers and treatments that could revolutionize how chronic pain is managed. The story of CIP reveals an uncomfortable truth. Pain, though dreaded, is essential. It teaches children not to touch fire, warns adults when bones break, and forces rest when the body is damaged. Those who cannot feel pain live in constant danger, not because of what they feel, but because of what they cannot. As one researcher put it, quote, "Pain protects us. Without it, survival itself is at risk," unquote. Dissociative identity disorder, known by the acronym DID, was previously known as multiple personality disorder. It's believed that 1.1 to 1.5% of the world's population has it. An article in The Independent states, quote, "DID is a creative mental survival strategy whereby the personality splits at a young age due to severe and chronic trauma," unquote. Dr. Mary Seymour, a clinical psychologist, said that when someone experiences something traumatic, quote, "a part of the person can capture those memories and keep the rest of the person safe by holding on to those and isolating them. The body remembers it, but it's not pushed away. It simply holds on to it and doesn't share it," unquote. One of the more notable cases of DID is Trudy Chase, which is not her birth name. She was born in 1935 and grew up in New York State. Chase had a very tragic and sad life, and the trauma of that experience is why she developed DID. The trauma she experienced wasn't known to her until she went to therapy. Through therapy, the experiences that were buried started coming back to her. She was only 2 years old when her mother left her father and married her stepfather. Her stepfather both physically and sexually abused her, starting when she was just 2. She also learned in therapy that her mother was abusive to her. She endured the abuse until she was 16 years old, and then she ran away from home. She changed her name to Trudy Chase because she didn't want anyone from her former life to find her. Chase explained she first realized she was living with different personalities when she heard a voice inside her head. She quickly realized that there were more. It turned out that she had 92 personalities. She referred to her personalities as her troops, and they all remembered different parts of her life. She believed that the personalities emerged because, as she put it, quote, something has to give, unquote. She continued, saying, quote, you can't dump that much on a human being and not lose something, unquote. She has also referred to herself and others living with DID as being in a much better situation than they were before. She said, quote, multiplicity keeps you sane under the worst conditions. I am sane. We are sane. Believe it or not, it's easier to deal with than the abuse was, unquote. Her personalities had different names. They included Black Catherine, who was an angry person. Another was Rabbit, and they were the personality that dealt with the trauma. Rabbit didn't speak, they just howled because of the pain. This is where the title of Chase's 1987 memoir, When the Rabbit Howls, comes from. In 1990, Chase's life was the basis for the miniseries, The Voices Within the Lives of Trudy Chase. That same year, Chase got national attention when she was interviewed about her condition on The Oprah Winfrey Show. Not everyone's experiences with DID are the same. In Trudy Chase's situation, some of her personalities were dormant, and some didn't even know each other. Chase's therapist was Dr. Robert Phillips, and he said that DID is actually a creative way for someone to manage their trauma. He said, quote, it seems to be something about the brain, about the mind, which allows this very creative process to come in and help defend a person. It is usually a person who is abused very, very young, before a personality is formed. Because the person is so young, it's incredibly difficult for them to manage everything happening to them. Not only that, but people living with DID are very capable, and DID actually helps them be functional in their lives, unquote. Trudy Chase died in March 2010 at age 74. Some symptoms generally associated with zombies are aggressive behavior, anxiety, hallucinations, and paralysis. And those symptoms are actually shared with a current, very real disease, rabies. Rabies is a virus that affects the central nervous system and can cause erratic and violent behavior. But that doesn't happen often, right? Since the most common way for rabies to be transmitted is through an animal's bite, and since so many pets are vaccinated early for rabies, there are very few cases of the virus anymore. However, viruses can mutate and change, and they can bypass the immunity provided to us through vaccines. We've seen it happen with various variants during the COVID-19 pandemic. New variants bypass the immunity offered by existing vaccines. One theory for how rabies could develop into a pandemic status would be if rabies were transmitted through the air rather than a bite, and if it mutated enough to evade our vaccinations. The question is, how would this change things? Well, we would get something like the rage virus, like in 28 days later and 28 weeks later. It would spread much more easily since direct contact is no longer necessary, and simply breathing it in through the air would be enough to contract the virus. Secondly, if it were to mutate to evade our current vaccines, there would be no immediate medication to cure it. Together, this would lead us to a zombie apocalypse. The question that needs to be asked about this scary possibility is, can a virus like rabies be engineered to affect humans to this level? Samita Andreski, a virologist at the University of Miami, says there is a hypothetical chance that a disease like rabies could mutate into a disease that could cause the rage virus. However, it would need to borrow several characteristics from other already existing viruses. It would take making the virus airborne, like flu viruses, then having it change people's behaviors, like the measles virus. It would then need to make the person develop a high temperature in their brain, like encephalitis, and then finally something to make you bleed, like Ebola. Together, these symptoms will lead to what we commonly associate with zombies and their condition. However, she doesn't think that something like this would happen. She said nature doesn't allow all these things to happen simultaneously. Ultimately, these different viruses are genetically distinct, meaning rabies and influenza won't hybridize to share characteristics. So we're safe from airborne rabies, and the hypothetical rage virus will stay hypothetical. For now. In 1978, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was ongoing. A year earlier, Jimmy Carter was sworn in as the 39th President of the United States. As the newly elected president, Carter set to change the U.S.'s foreign policy, which included better relations between the two superpowers and nuclear non-proliferation. However, the USSR had its own plans. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets kept their secrets close to their chests. On July 13, 1978, the Soviets had a story that sounded like the origin of a comic book superhero. Anatoly Vygotsky, a 36-year-old Russian particle physicist, was working on a particle accelerator at the Institute of High Energy Physics in Porvino. During a test of the U-70 synchrotron, which was the world's largest accelerator at the time, it malfunctioned. Vygotsky was sent to fix the problem. Unbeknownst to him, the safety measures meant to protect anyone entering the accelerator also malfunctioned. So when Vygotsky stuck his head in to see what the problem was, the accelerator was running. An invisible beam of protons struck the physicist in the back of the head. The beam passed through Vygotsky's brain at the speed of light. He felt no pain, but he saw a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. However, no one noticed any problems, so Vygotsky continued to work the rest of the day and didn't tell anyone what had happened. Knowing what his fate was going to be, he headed home to wait for his inevitable death. Normally, a person dies when they come into contact with 500 rads of radiation, and Vygotsky received 200,000 to 300,000 rads straight to the brain. During the night, he felt uncomfortable and couldn't sleep. Also, the left side of his face had swollen to the point where he was unrecognizable. In the morning, he went to seek medical help from doctors. They sent him to a clinic in Moscow, but it wasn't for treatment. Instead, they wanted to observe him for the last moments of his life. Over the next few days, Vygotsky's skin peeled around the entry wound on the back of his head. Also, the skin peeled off around the exit wound, which was his nose. The doctor could see it burn right through his skin, skull, and brain, but amazingly, he did not die. Not knowing how, doctors watched as Vygotsky made a full recovery. He even returned to the same job 18 months later. He promised to appear at the Moscow clinic twice a year where doctors could keep studying him. In the following years, Vygotsky's brain tissue continued to burn away, the left side of his face became paralyzed, and he also lost hearing on the left side. On the weirder side, his face only aged on the right side. Following his recovery, Vygotsky completed his PhD and kept working at the U-70 synchrotron as the coordinator of physics experiments. Although missing tissue in his brain, he showed no signs of intellectual capacity, but he did suffer from seizures. Because of the Soviet secrecy on nuclear power, Rogowski was not allowed to speak about the accident. But then, in 1986, the Chernobyl disaster happened. This put the USSR's nuclear program under the microscope of the world. Over a decade after Rogowski's accident, he was now able to talk about it. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the use of the accelerator was abandoned. In 1996, Rogowski applied for disability status to receive free medication for his epilepsy, but he was denied. Rogowski continues to live in Protvino. He wants to move west to make himself available for study, but he cannot afford to move. Although no one is 100% sure why Rogowski survived the accident, doctors and researchers have a theory. They surmise that since the beam contained such a narrow focus, the beam that passed through Rogowski's brain only caused damage to the parts of the brain that he could live without. Unlike a person getting a full blast of radiation all over their body, Rogowski's vital organs were not affected. At the time of this video, Rogowski is 80 years old. Unfortunately, he has no signs of superhero abilities unless you count the one side of his face not aging. Gemma and Leanne Hoden were only 15 when their twin telepathy saved the day. One day, Leanne was taking a bath, and Gemma had a feeling that she wanted to check on Leanne. Nothing but a feeling made her see if anything was going on with her sister. Luckily, she followed through with that gut instinct, because when Leanne found her sister, she was underwater. She wasn't sure at first if she was underwater for a reason, like washing her hair or even playing around with her sister by hiding underwater. But it soon became evident that something was seriously wrong. When Gemma pulled Leanne's head out of the water, her skin was blue. Gemma leaped into action and called 999. For all our non-United Kingdom viewers, 999 is what they use instead of 911. While she waited for help to arrive, Gemma performed CPR on her sister and revived her. Gemma's actions saved her twin sister's life. The paramedics confirmed that Leanne would have died if not for Gemma's actions. How this happened is, of course, a mystery. It turns out that Leanne had epilepsy and had an epileptic seizure in the tub. Leanne has described how it feels when she has a seizure, and she said she often feels dizzy. So Gemma has wondered if perhaps she was responding to that feeling when she felt the urge to go and check on her. Leroy is a town in western New York. One of the best known facts about the town is that Jell-O was invented there in 1897, and the gelatin was first manufactured in the town. The Jell-O Museum is downtown. In October 2011, the Leroy Junior/High School had around 600 students. One student was 16-year-old Katie Krotwurst. She was a cheerleader. One day in October 2011, Katie woke up from a nap and something felt off. Then her face started to spasm and her chin jutted out uncontrollably. Katie's family was alarmed and she was taken to the emergency room by ambulance. The doctors thought she was having an anxiety attack. The twitches continued and Katie returned to the hospital. More tests were conducted and there was not anything physically wrong with her. A few weeks later, Katie's best friend and fellow cheerleader, 17-year-old Thera Sanchez, started stuttering after a nap. Then her head started to jerk, her face twitched, and her arms flailed uncontrollably. The doctors told her that the tics were stress-related. A couple weeks later, another cheerleader developed tics. Her arm swung and she hummed. A fourth cheerleader was soon afflicted. She made odd noises and had physical tics. It got to be so bad that the girls didn't do cheerleading and missed school. On days when they did attend school, they usually left early. Then other girls who weren't cheerleaders began to suffer tics. One girl, Lydia Parker, developed severe tics. She would punch herself so hard in the face that she bruised herself. She also had blackouts and seizures. Her legs became numb and she started using a wheelchair. A boy and a 36-year-old woman also developed odd and uncontrollable tics. In total, at least 18 people in Leroy had developed the tics. They were described as Tourette-like tics, but it was not Tourette syndrome because that usually develops earlier in life, on average at the age of 6. Also, Tourette syndrome is not contagious. The New York State Department of Health launched an investigation. Water and soil samples were taken, but nothing unusual was found. In January 2012, Katie, Thera, and their mothers appeared on the Today Show. They talked about how miserable the tics had made their lives. Katie's tics were mild during the segment, while Thera's were intense. Experts concluded it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. The people who were inflicted had lost stress in their lives. For example, Katie was a straight-A student and a cheerleader. Katie's father was not in the picture. A week before the tics, her mother had her 13th brain surgery. Thera's family had suffered a private tragedy years earlier. Her father wasn't involved in her life, and her mother had just started dating a new man. Lydia's mother and grandmother worked long hours and nights, and she was often left in charge of her 5-year-old sister. Her abusive father was no longer around. However, some people, like environmentalist Aaron Brockovich, believed that a toxin was responsible for the tics. The small town became a media circus. Under the media spotlight, the tics got worse. Experts said that this was evidence it was mass psychogenic illness. The media stressed the victims out more, which worsened the tics. They were eventually diagnosed with conversion disorder. According to the Cleveland Clinic, quote, "Conversion disorder is a condition where a mental health issue disrupts how your brain works. This causes real, physical symptoms that a person can't control. Symptoms can include seizures, weakness or paralysis, or reduce input from one or more senses, i.e., sight, sound, etc." Unquote. They all received treatment and their symptoms were gone 8 months later by the end of the school year in June. In May 2008, 59-year-old Velma Thomas lived in Nitro, West Virginia. When she was at home, she suffered a massive heart attack. Paramedics were called to her home and they performed CPR on her. After 8 minutes of working on her, they found a pulse. She was taken to the hospital. The hospital used a special machine that induces hypothermia to reduce brain damage. While undergoing the treatment, her heart stopped again. She was revived, but hours later, her heart stopped a third time, so she was put on life support. Velma was on life support for 17 hours, and there was no pulse, no blood pressure, or any measurable brain activity. Velma's family sadly realized she was gone. Her son, Tim Thomas, told the Charleston Daily Mail, quote, "Her skin had already started hardening. Her hands and toes were curling up. They were already drawn. There was no life there." Unquote. The family decided it was best to take her off life support. Tim said he felt at peace and believed he had made the right choice. Tim and other family members all said their goodbyes. Then they left to make funeral arrangements. When they left the hospital, Velma didn't have a heartbeat. The respirator was turned off after the family left. About 10 minutes later, the nurses started removing the tubing. Then Velma started moving her arms, and then she coughed. She then shocked the hospital staff by talking. The hospital staff called the family and told them to come back to the hospital. When they arrived, they were amazed to see Velma alive and talking. While Velma was in the hospital, she even did an interview with the local television station. Velma experienced a phenomenon called the Lazarus syndrome, also known as auto-resuscitation, after failed cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Lazarus is a biblical figure in the New Testament who was raised from the dead by Jesus. The syndrome is when someone spontaneously comes back to life. Medical professionals are unsure why it happens, but several recorded cases exist. Velma Thomas holds the record for the longest time being clinically dead before coming back to life. Medical science has come a long way over the years. People are surviving now once fatal accidents. But even today, getting a 43-inch long spike through your entire brain, doctors would probably say, "That dude is screwed." However, this very accident happened in 1848, and the man became one of neuroscience's most famous patients. On September 13, 1848, Phineas Gage, a 25-year-old railroad construction foreman, was working in Cavendish, Vermont. While Gage was in charge of blasting, he would drill a hole, place an explosive in the hole, fill it with sand, and then pack it down with a metal tamping iron bar. Unfortunately, the metal bar sparked this time, causing an explosion that sent the bar skyward. But before it flew 80 feet, the 43-inch long, 1¼ inch diameter, 13-pound rod penetrated Gage's left cheek behind his eye socket and exited through the top of his head. Astonishingly, Gage survived the impalement. He even walked to a nearby train cart where there were other workers. He was rushed to the doctors in town. The whole time he remained conscious and could even remember the names of his co-workers. He was even in good spirits, saying to the doctor that he didn't want to see any of his friends from work because he would return to work in a day or two. Although he survived the seemingly impossible, Gage was not out of the woods yet. He developed an infection and was semi-comatose between September 23rd and October 3rd. It wasn't until October 7th that he took his first steps out of bed. By October 11th, he began to regain his intellectual functions. During his recovery, his doctor, John Martin Harlow, took great interest in his case. The doctor noted that Gage knew how much time had passed since the accident and clearly recalled how the accident happened. But Gage had difficulty estimating sizes and amounts of money. After a few months, he was well enough to return to his parents' house in New Hampshire. While Gage was recovering, Dr. Harlow was told by many of Gage's friends and family that he didn't seem the same. People described him as no longer being Gage. Before the accident, he was a hard-working and pleasant man. After the accident, he was described as a surly, aggressive, heavy drinker with the grossest profanity. He couldn't stick to plans and didn't respect other people. Because of his personality change, the railroad construction company didn't hire him back on. This caught Dr. Harlow's attention. In the 1800s, medicine was not very advanced in neuroscience. So, to see a personality change after brain trauma was a major revelation. Before this accident, phrenologists would measure bumps on people's skulls to assess people's personalities. Phineas Gage's accident and personality change was the first evidence that your brain controls personality. Dr. Harlow would go on to write a paper that appeared in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal in late 1848. This would become one of the most celebrated papers and helped establish neuroscience as we know it today. It would take some time until scientists and doctors figured out what happened to make Gage a different person mentally. Although Gage wasn't welcomed back to the railroad, he spent some time traveling around New England and Europe doing odd tamping jobs for money. After traveling around for a bit, he returned to New Hampshire and worked in a livery stable. But he had problems holding down jobs. The longest job he held was as a long-haul stagecoach driver in Chile. He worked for them for 7 years until his health declined. Gage moved to San Francisco, California to be with his mother, who took care of him. On May 21, 1860, Phineas Gage died after he suffered a series of epileptic seizures. He was only 36 years old. 12 years after the accident, neuroscience's most famous patient was buried. However, he wouldn't stay buried. 7 years later, Gage's brother had him exhumed and donated his skull to Dr. Harlow and the tamping iron that traveled through it. Dr. Harlow published a final paper in 1868 in which he recounted what he was able to learn from Gage. He donated Gage's skull and the tamping rod to the Harvard University School of Medicine. You can still see the exhibit today in the museum. In the decades after his death, Gage's case can be found in almost all neuroscience textbooks. Malcolm Macmillan, an honorary professor at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences and author of An Odd Kind of Fame, Stories of Phineas Gage, said he was the first case you could say fairly definitively that injury to the brain produced some kind of change in personality. In the 1940s, Stanley Cobb, a famous neurologist, diagrammed the skull to determine the path the tamping rod went through. With the advancement in technology, they recreated the diagram using CT scans. In 1994, researchers constructed a 3D model in which they discovered the reason for the personality change. As neuroscience developed, it was determined that Gage's accident happened in the perfect location. The path the rod traveled through missed areas of the brain such as the preagoid plexus and the canaverous sinus, which, if hit, would have caused him to bleed out and die. They discovered that the rod damaged both the left and right prefrontal cortexes. These are highly important areas that control a person's emotional processing, rational decision-making, language, and social cognition. More recent studies of the brain found the effects were more limited to the left frontal lobe. During a 2012 study, researchers combined a CT scan of Gage's skull and an MRI scan of typical brains. It showed the brain's wiring and where the rod went through. They estimated that it destroyed approximately 11% of white matter in the frontal lobe and 4% of the cerebral cortex. So luckily for Phineas Gage, the rod missed all those areas for him to survive, and lucky for us, that changed his personality. It was lucky for us because we now have a better understanding of neuroscience. In 1886, a London physician, Dr. Jonathan Hutchinson, described a young patient with strange features. Thin skin, baldness, and a small jaw, though the child was only a few years old. 17 years later, Dr. Hastings Guilford reported another case. Together, their names would become attached to a condition now known as Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, or HGPS. It is one of the rarest and most devastating genetic disorders. HGPS is caused by a mutation in the LMNA gene, which normally makes a protein called lamin A a structural support for the cell's nucleus. In children with progeria, the mutation creates a faulty version called a progeriin, which builds up inside cells and makes them unstable. This tiny molecular mistake causes the body to age up to 10 times the normal rate. Children with HGPS are usually born healthy, but within the first 2 years, symptoms emerge. These symptoms are slow growth and short stature, hair loss, thin, tight skin, prominent eyes and veins, and stiff joints and hip problems. Most telling, their bodies develop severe cardiovascular disease, normally seen in the elderly. Strokes and heart attacks are often the leading cause of death, often by the early teens. The average life expectancy is 13 to 15 years. One of the most widely known cases was Sam Burns, an American boy diagnosed with progeria. He became the subject of the HBO documentary Life According to Sam and inspired millions with his optimism. Sam said, quote, "I don't put myself in front of you to have you feel bad for me. I put myself in front of you to let you know you don't have to feel bad for yourself," unquote. Sam's case was more than inspirational. It pushed research forward. His parents founded the Progeria Research Foundation, which helped scientists identify the LMNA mutation in 2003 and later tested a drug called ionofarnib. In 2020, the U.S. FDA approved ionofarnib as the first treatment for people with progeria. Clinical trials show it can extend life by 2 to 5 years by slowing the buildup of porogen in cells. HGPS is not the only rapid aging disorder. Werner syndrome is caused by mutations in the WR gene and appears in young adults who begin aging rapidly in their 20s. They often develop gray hair, cataracts, osteoporosis, and cancer. The average lifespan for people with this gene mutation is about their mid-40s to 50s. Cocchinani syndrome is a mutation in the ERCC6 or ERCC8, begins in childhood, causing growth failure, neurological decline, and premature aging features. Their life expectancy is usually into their teens or 20s. Rothman-Tundram syndrome is a mutation in the RECQ-L4 and causes skin abnormalities, sparse hair, small features, and higher cancer risk. All these disorders link back to one theme: problems with DNA repair or nuclear stability. Without proper repair mechanisms, cells accumulate damage at extreme rates, driving rapid aging. However, HGPS is rare. It affects only about 1 in 20 million births worldwide. These children have transformed science's understanding of aging. Porogen, the toxic protein at the center of HGPS, is also found in healthy people, just at much lower levels. Its slow accumulation is thought to play a role in normal human aging. By studying children like Sam Burns and others with HGPS, scientists are not only searching for treatments for rare disorders, but also uncovering the biological roots of aging itself. April 1958. A rhesus monkey roams around the laboratory at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. A doctor in a white lab coat places some grapes on the table. The monkey trots over to the grapes and grabs them. Then it ambles back to its cage, climbs the bars, perched up high as it eats its treat. The doctor is pleased. Not bad, considering it only has half a brain. In fact, Dr. Robert White had removed one entire side of the monkey's brain to study just how much of a brain was needed for the animal to function. Given that the monkey had lived for 2 years so far, he deemed the experiment a success. But he wanted to go further. 5 years later, Dr. White completely removed a monkey's brain, kept it chilled, and connected the brain to machines to keep it alive. Amazingly, the brain was able to live outside the monkey's body for a few hours. "I don't know exactly what it means," he told the United Press International. "We have a brain totally disconnected from its body, but it's still alive." Obviously, animal rights groups were furious. They wrote angry letters to newspapers demanding the barbaric experiments stop. Ever the good, mad scientist, White called the protesters short-sighted and reminded them to read the Bible. God, he said, had given man dominion over animals. And, with a clear conscience, he continued his experiments. In 1965, White and his team removed one dog's brain and attached it to another still living dog. According to White, the brain survived for 3 days. Given this success, White's only logical next step was something straight out of a science fiction movie: a complete head transplant. In March 1970, at the Cleveland Metropolitan Hospital, White and his team of brain researchers gathered around an operating table. On the table was another rhesus monkey. The doctors then spent the next 18 hours carefully severing the monkey's head from its body. They carefully cut the simian's tiny nerves, blood vessels, and tendons. Then they just carefully sewed them onto the headless body of another monkey. Once the surgery was completed, the doctor sat back and waited. There's no report of how they felt when, after a few hours of recovery, the monkey opened its eyes. And this wasn't just some kind of Aldini-esque reflex. This monkey, with its brand new head, was legitimately alive. While the monkey was still unable to move thanks to the spinal column being severed in the operation, the doctors tested several responses. Amazingly, the monkey could smell and it could hear noises. Its eyes followed the doctors as they crossed in front of it. He even gnashed to bite one researcher when he tried to feed it. And the monkey lived for 8 days. The doctor said it died because the body rejected the new tissue. Dr. White became something of a sensation based on this operation, and he loved the publicity. He wrote hundreds of scholarly journal articles and appeared at hundreds of medical conferences. And he often referred to his work as Frankensteinish. Reporters from People magazine, GQ, and the New York Times sought him out, as did X-File producer Chris Carter. But sadly, White was never able to take the next medical leap forward by performing a human head transplant. The science just doesn't exist, he said, to be able to reconnect the spinal nerves to prevent paralysis. Dr. Robert J. White passed away in 2010, but his pioneering work has helped create cooling blankets used to chill brains after heart attacks and strokes to prevent brain damage. And there have been other doctors determined to finish White's work. In 2016, Dr. Sergio Canavario announced he was ready to transplant a human head, making him something like the son of Frankenstein. Next, we're going to get a little sciencey and talk about something we're sure the average person hasn't heard of: prions. So, to break it down, bodies need protein. Proteins are folded in a certain way and have different amino acids. And all proteins have specific functions for the body. However, there are times when proteins are not shaped correctly and thus cannot function properly in a person's body. This is even more dangerous if it's a PRP protein. When it's in the incorrect shape, it becomes a proteinaceous infectious particle, which is also known as, yep, you guessed it, a prion. Are we all sciencey smart now? Then this prion causes other proteins to be misshapen, and those proteins affect other proteins, etc., etc. This causes a disease called transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, or simply prion disease. Ultimately, this gives the brain a sponge-like look due to there actually being holes in the brain, like a sponge. In a Vox article, they describe prions as the zombie-like pathogenic proteins that aren't alive and can't be killed. And, scarily enough, that Vox article discussed a real-life case of prions taking over brains. The disease is referred to as chronic wasting disease and is found in deer, elk, reindeer, and moose. When an animal is infected with this disease, they begin to have hallucinations, they begin to show signs of dementia, and they also have difficulty walking. It's called chronic wasting disease because the animal also stops eating and becomes so thin that they waste away. The virus is spread through several different forms of contact. For example, the disease can be transmitted through contact with an infected animal's fecal matter or blood. The scary aspect of this illness is that the animal can be infected for years without showing any symptoms, and in that time it can spread the disease to others. Not only that, but the only way to diagnose the disease is through cutting into the brain, something we can only do after the animal has passed away. Up until now, this particular disease has only been transmitted from animal to animal, not to humans. In fact, there was a case in 2005 where people ate venison infected with CWD. Many who consumed the meat participated in a study to see if they would eventually start showing symptoms. The good news is that none of them contracted the illness, so maybe we're safe from the wasting disease. However, experiments have been conducted to see if prions with CWD can infect human cells in a petri dish, and it turns out they can, so there's no knowing what the future may hold. In an article for Popular Science entitled, "Could Scientists Really Create a Zombie Virus?" the question is raised on how prion infections can be weaponized to create a zombie pandemic, if, you were evil. The prion is considered the best means to begin a zombie apocalypse because of how they infect the brain and how difficult they are to destroy, and because there's no cure to end their destruction. They further contend that the simplest way to spread the disease would be to attach it to an already established virus, something contagious. The only downside to this villainous plan is once the prion starts, it doesn't stop. They posited in this article that you don't want the zombies to become lethargic and die. The solution is to raise the pH, as this would render it difficult for the prions to reproduce. That way you would have people in a zombie-like state without everyone dying off easily. I guess we just outlined how you, at home, could start a zombie pandemic. Luckily, this is way too hard to do. From Mississippi to Europe, Poland specifically, in the same year as Walter Williams, 2014, but later in that year, November 6th to be exact. A 91-year-old woman named Janina Kokovic, who lived in the small town of Ostro-Lubysky, was thought to be dead when she stopped breathing, her heart stopped beating, she had no pulse, and she had no movement in her pupils. Her niece called the doctor, who examined her and declared her dead, and then her body was sent to the funeral home to begin the embalming process. Only 11 hours later, the funeral home called her doctor to say that Kokovic was very much alive and had been lying in a body bag in a cold storage room. Her doctor, who declared her dead, Dr. Tush, said, quote, "I was sure she was dead." She went on to say, "I'm stunned. I don't understand what happened. Her heart had stopped beating. She was no longer breathing. If I had my doubts, I would have called an ambulance, done an electrocardiogram, but I was sure that the patient is dead." There's no theory for what exactly happened to Kokovic that day, but there was an investigation into the matter as to why she was left in the cold storage room. The results of that investigation could not be found online. However, Kokovic didn't seem to be fazed by the incident. Apparently, when they opened her body bag, she told them she was cold and would like a cup of tea. A very reasonable response given everything that happened to her. Apart from that, she said she felt fine. It was also reported that she had late-stage dementia, so she was not fully aware of the events that had befallen her. The only problem was that, because she was declared dead, she could not continue to receive her pension. Government officials had to make sure her death declaration was reversed for her to continue receiving it. One would think that coming back from the dead would call for a fancy meal. But when she got home, she had a bowl of soup and 2 pancakes. We hope she enjoyed it. It's unknown what happened to Janina Kokovic after she was resurrected, but if she's still alive today, she'd be 100 years old. Strasbourg is a city in modern France near the Rhine River. In 1518, it was a free city in the Holy Roman Empire. On July 14, 1518, a city resident, Frau Trophy, stepped out of her house and inexplicably started dancing. Once she started dancing, she couldn't stop. She only stopped when she fell down exhausted. But when she woke up, she got back onto her bloody and swollen feet and continued to dance. Records differ, but she danced from 4 to 6 days. She ate and drank very little. She only stopped when she was too exhausted to stand. Finally, the authorities sent her on a 3-day wagon trip to the shrine of St. Vitus. Saint Vitus is the patron saint of dancers and entertainers. A common belief in 16th century Europe was that Saint Vitus could curse people to dance uncontrollably. After visiting the shrine, Frau Trophy was cured, but unfortunately, the plague had spread before she was sent away. Frau Trophy was cured, but unfortunately, the plague spread before she was sent away. 30 other people had started dancing and could control themselves. Even when they were injured, like their feet were bleeding, they kept dancing. There are accounts that some people also foamed at the mouth. Some screamed and laughed uncontrollably. There are also some accounts that people hallucinated. The dancing baffled and alarmed the town's civil and religious leaders. There were different theories about what was causing the dancing. Some thought it was demonic possession. Others believed that their blood was overheated. They thought the cure was for people to dance more. So carpenters built dance floors in guild halls and markets. They hired musicians to play music, and professional dancers also helped by coaching the dancers. The theory was that people would dance until the urge to dance left them. The more they danced, the quicker the urge would leave them. But this only worsened things, and the dancing plague spread to 400 people. Some even danced themselves to death. 15 people were supposedly dying a day. If this is accurate, it could mean that hundreds of people died by dancing themselves to death. They often suffered strokes or heart attacks. So after about 2 months, the dance floors were destroyed. Those still inflicted with the dancing were sent to the shrine of St. Vitus, and they were cured. The dance epidemic of 1518 wasn't the only dance epidemic to hit Europe. There were several between the 10th and 16th centuries. One of the first recorded ones was on Christmas Eve, 1021. 18 people outside of church in Kolbig, which is in modern-day Germany, danced uncontrollably. They became so loud they disrupted the church service. They were ordered to stop, but they couldn't. Another notable case happened in 1247 in Maastricht, a city in modern-day Netherlands. A group of people danced on a bridge over the Moselle River. The bridge collapsed, and all 200 people drowned. One of the most famous cases happened in 1374 in several towns along the Rhine River. It lasted for 6 months, and hundreds of people were victims of the dance plague. Some people died after breaking their ribs or loins. The 1518 plague is the last and best documented case of the dancing plague, also known as dancing mania. Modern-day researchers have several theories about what caused the dancing plague. One theory is that people ate bread that was made from rye flour containing ergot. Ergot is a fungal disease that causes convulsions and hallucinations. The condition is known as St. Anthony's fire. Another theory is that they were members of a heretical cult that worship by dancing. The leading theory is from medical historian John Waller, who argues it was a form of mass psychogenic illness. He points out that the people of Strasbourg were under an incredible amount of stress. At the time, the area was suffering from a series of famines. They were also dealing with outbreaks of smallpox and syphilis. Smallpox is one of the deadliest diseases in history. Not only is it fatal, but it's very painful. Survivors can also be left badly scarred. Syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection, emerged for the first time in Europe around 1494. Untreated syphilis can lead to heart disease and brain and nerve damage. But why did people dance instead of laugh, for example? Waller's theory is that people in 16th century Europe believed that St. Vitus could curse people with the dancing plague. This superstition became an outlet to their stress. Another name for the uncontrollable dancing plague is called St. Vitus dance. However, it should not be confused with Siedheimskria, which is also called St. Vitus's dance. Sihamskria is a neurological disorder that affects children. It causes them to have jerky, uncontrollable movements. Another name for the dancing plague is choreomania. Waller said that the other dancing plagues also happen at stressful times. For example, in 1374, when another dancing plague emerged, the area had just suffered one of the worst floods in modern European history. It does not appear that there have been any other dancing plagues in the past 500 years. There's an old magician's trick involving a blindfold. The magician puts it on and is able to physically tell a volunteer exactly what's being held in their hands. It's a neat trick, a regular crowd pleaser, but it's still a trick. In magic shops, you'll often find such blindfolds for sale. They are specifically woven so that when eyed in a certain direction, the fabric fibers become see-through. The magician ties the blindfold to the volunteer one way, and the volunteer confirms to the crowd he can't see. Then the magician puts on the blindfold himself upside down, and he can see through it. Ta-da! But FBI agent W.A. Brannigan was well aware of this trick blindfold when he met with William Foose and his 16-year-old daughter, Margaret. The nature of the July 1957 meeting precluded using the offices of the FBI, so instead they huddled in a Marriott hotel room off U.S. Highway 1 near Arlington, Virginia. William had come to the FBI with a potential game changer. He had taught his daughter how to read books while blindfolded. Physically, she could tell you what was on the pages just by touching them. Dr. Foose had already been to the NSA and the CIA with his demonstration, and they were interested, but he had come to Hoover's FBI to see if they wanted to make a better offer. For him to teach agents how to awaken the same ESP superpower from their subconscious, just as he had done for his own daughter. Now, at this point, we know you're thinking, it sounds like a carnival sideshow. And that's exactly what Agent Brannigan was thinking that day in 1957. Before allowing this man to do his demonstration, Brannigan admitted that he had already done a background check on Foose through the Richmond FBI office. What he found was that Foose was a pretty normal guy. He didn't make himself out to be special in any way. He wasn't an expert on ESP or a practitioner of the psychic arts. He was simply the foreman in the salvage warehouse of the C&O Railroad in Virginia. He was president of his town's 4-H club. He even raised bunnies as a hobby. Until one day he got in his head that he might be able to help blind people read without the use of braille text. He started working with 4 kids to perfect his method, which was patent pending, but he soon found that his teenage daughter, Margaret, who was not visually impaired, showed the most promise. He first took his demonstration to the Blinded Veterans Association, where Dr. William Thompson submitted to Foose blindfold training. As Dr. Thompson later reported, he would put a package of cigarettes up to my face and describe it. He would then put it someplace on the table and tell me to pick it up. The result, according to the skeptical doctor, was quite promising. My percentage of hits was high, he admitted. For his part, Foose said that his goal was to pass on his knowledge to others, so they could teach it to still others. To the point where visually impaired people could, well, read. If I can teach one blind person to read print, I will feel that my efforts have been worthwhile, he told a Virginia newspaper. So where does the FBI come in? The agent asked. Foose responded that he hoped to form a startup company with 3 other men, and an FBI endorsement and perhaps a healthy donation would go a long way to helping launch his company. At this point, Agent Brannigan told Foose and his daughter to begin their demonstration. But when William took out his blindfold, the agent stopped him. They would be using a blindfold supplied by the FBI, thank you very much. Brannigan then placed a thick cotton ball over each of Margaret's eyes and secured them with a thick, dark elastic band over her head. That, he thought, should prevent any trickery. Soon, however, the agent's skepticism turned to astonishment as, over the next hour, Margaret demonstrated a stunning array of extrasensory abilities. As the FBI agent later wrote in his official, now declassified FBI memo, Miss Foos was able to read a Bible opened at a random page simply by touching that page. She was also able to read the materials the FBI agent supplied to her, both printed material, like random magazines, as well as anything the agent wrote down then and there. Behind the blindfold, Margaret was able to distinguish colors of objects and even trace someone's handwriting. As Agent Brannigan reported later, Margaret did this, quote, without error, as with complete vision, unquote. In the memo, Agent Brannigan then recommended that the FBI give Foos whatever he wanted to foster this unique ability, because the potential use in crime fighting would be invaluable. There is no limit to value which could accrue to the FBI, his memo reads, complete and undetectable access to mail in diplomatic pouches, visual access to buildings, the possibilities are unlimited. On August 9, 1957, Agent Brannigan hadn't heard back from the higher-ups at the FBI, so he wrote another memo as a follow-up. When that memo was released later as part of a Freedom of Information Act request, it had strangely been fully redacted. A month later, an FBI agent named Nichols wrote a memo to J. Edgar Hoover's right-hand man, Clyde Tolson, indicating that there should be no further involvement with Mr. Foos or his daughter. There wasn't much information about William and Margaret after that 1957 meeting. One report has him moving his family to California later in that same year. Another says he died of heart disease in 1972 at the age of 53 in Washington, D.C. As one later unclassified FBI memo reads, we should not, under any circumstances, allow Foos the privilege of indicating to outsiders the FBI is interested in his work. In Greek mythology, there exists the story of a dog with multiple heads that guards the entrance to hell. It's known as the Hound of Hades, Cerberus. A Russian surgeon, Vladimir Demikhov, once turned myth into reality. During the 1940s, the Soviet scientists had been a pioneer in the concept of organ transplantation. Working almost exclusively with dogs, Demikhov was the first person to perform a heart transplant, a lung transplant, and a liver transplant on canines. He even gave man's best friend a coronary bypass operation in 1952. He called transplantology a powerful new weapon in the fight to prolong the life of man. That kind of work seems like it would benefit mankind. Then again, Demikhov would go on to give a dog named Andreyka 2 hearts, and he was fascinated with the idea of transplanting monkey organs into a human body. He also once called for transplantable organs to be grown and stored in the bodies of human vegetables. Dr. Robert J. White called him an amazing experimental surgeon. It put Demikhov in ghoulish company indeed. It was after an operation in 1958 that the 42-year-old Demikhov would cement his status as a real-life Dr. Frankenstein. In September of that year, the doctor prepared 2 dogs for surgery. One was named Shavka, a golden-colored puppy. There was a 9-year-old German Shepherd named Brodiaga. After anesthetizing both animals, he made a large incision in Brodiaga's back, exposing the dog's jugular vein, aorta, and spinal column. Then Dr. Demikhov cut the puppy in half. Just behind its front legs, he kept the dog's heart and lungs. Then he carefully sutured the puppy's head and shoulders onto the back of the fully grown dog. Using a special developed technique, he joined the puppy's main blood vessels to the carotid artery and jugular vein of the adult dog, and then he waited. Yet those who envision this experiment taking place in some torchlit underground lab have another thing coming. The surgery was government approved and took place at the Moscow Medical Institute as American neuropathologist and Norwegian surgeon looked on. When the dog, or dogs, awoke from surgery, the visiting doctors were amazed. The surgery appeared to have been a resounding, if improbable, success. In the coming days, scientists observed some fascinating behaviors from the dogs. When it was hot, both dogs panted in unison. When the older dog wanted to eat, so did the puppy. And they both ate with seemingly no issues. When the older dog tried to shake off its new appendage, the puppy would simply nip at the back of its neck. However, this behavior only lasted all of 4 days. As one newspaper reported, the surgery was a success, but the patient died. Demikoff was undeterred and replicated the two-headed dog surgery at least a dozen times more, stretching into the late 1960s. During that decade, some media outlets mocked the doctor's work. Others were horrified by it, calling it cruel and sadistic. There was at least one man who wasn't repulsed by Demikoff's efforts in the field of transplantology. His name was Louis Washkansky. On December 3, 1967, less than a decade after Demikoff's dog experiments, Washkansky became the first recipient of a human heart transplant. During the 5-hour operation, doctors removed the heart of Denise Darvell, a 25-year-old car crash victim, and implanted into the 54-year-old South African. The cardiac surgeon who performed the operation, Christian Bernard, became world famous. But he knew that his work and transplant surgery at large would not have been possible without the pioneering efforts of Dr. Vladimir Demikoff. "I have always maintained," Bernard said, "that there is a father of heart and lung transplantation. Demikoff certainly deserves that title." Today it can be said that Demikoff's research is very much alive. When we talk of comic superpowers, we often also talk about an origin story. An accident or an event that gives an otherwise ordinary person extraordinary abilities. For a girl named Angelique Hotan, that event was a storm. It was January 1856, and the weather over Angelique's village of Chateau Montemare in France was roiling. Rain and thunder and lightning had pelted her family's simple cottage for 8 days. It was about 8 p.m. on January 15th as Angelique, her aunt, and 2 other young women bided their time by weaving ladies' silk gloves. The aunt and the older girls were teaching Angelique how to do, for that time, women's work. At 12 years old, Angelique, they reasoned, was almost half a woman herself, and such tasks were necessary for her to learn. The glove work that day was done on an oak frame, cinched at the end with a metal clamp. After a particularly harsh spout of lightning, Angelique's frame suddenly leapt out of her lap and shot across the room. It upset a candle, which shrouded the cottage in darkness. The girls had a good laugh over the incident, implying it might have been a prank on Angelique's part. But as they settled back to continue their sewing, it happened again. Angelique's wood-gloved frame flew across the room. This time, however, no one was laughing, especially Angelique, who was growing more and more upset with this weird turn of events. The girl's aunt, for some reason, immediately proclaimed the girl was possessed by a demon. She hustled the other girls out of the cottage and called a priest to perform an exorcism on Angelique. The next day, the priest showed up, but he was barely able to keep his skepticism at bay. That is until Angelique made his chair overturn with a flick of her wrist. The priest turned to the aunt and told her that she didn't need a priest, she needed a doctor. Shortly after, a man named Dr. de Fremont arrived to take a look at Angelique, who, by this time, was starting to enjoy her new powers, whatever they were. Angelique picked up the wood-glove frame and it shot across the room just as it had during the storm. The doctor, try as he might, could not replicate the action himself, saying the only way the frame could fly so far and fast was that it had been thrown overhand at the wall. More tests were conducted. In one such test, 3 large men from the village held a chair down on the floor with all their strength. But when Angelique approached the chair, they pried loose from their grip and flew across the room. Now if you're a simple, God-fearing villager living in the middle of the 19th century, your first thought is probably going to be, this girl is a witch. And yeah, that's what everyone was starting to think. So Dr. de Fremont hustled Angelique and her aunt out of the village by carriage under the cover of darkness and brought her to see more doctors about her unique condition. Those doctors first observed that Angelique was simply unable to sit down anywhere. Every time she tried to sit in a chair, the chair would go flying with such force it often broke. Once she tried to sit on the bed, and the bed began shaking and rattling to the point it started to come apart. Given this observation, the doctors realized that in each case, the seat had been made partially of metal. The iron nails in the chairs and the wire frame of the bed. The wooden glove frame also had the metal clamp on its end. In 1853, the power of electricity was just starting to be understood and harnessed, but Dr. de Fremont knew enough that he tried a more simple experiment. He licked his hand and patted down the hairs on his own arm. He then touched Angelique's shoulder, and the hairs on his arm pointed upward. Electricity, thought. That must be the answer. Dr. de Fremont also made some other observations of Angelique herself during these episodes. At the moment of greatest action, he wrote in a paper later, a cool breeze or gaseous current seemed to flow from her person. If you have ever seen Drew Barrymore in the film Firestarter, you might have a good idea what that probably looked like. By February, just a month after her powers started to manifest, a French doctor named Tachon and another doctor named Arago decided to take things to the next level. They formed a committee of 6 doctors to investigate the case of Angelique Hotin. They brought the girl and her family to Paris and put them in an upscale apartment. Doctors from far and wide made a pilgrimage to Paris to observe Angelique for themselves. And the electric girl, as she was called, never failed to deliver. Chairs would fly across the room, tables would overturn when she attempted to lay her hands on them. Sparks even flew from her fingers, some said. In one experiment, the doctors took a skinned dead frog from a jar. They knew from their own experiments that introducing an electrical current to the frog could make its legs involuntarily kick. Angelique stood horrified as they placed the dead frog on her arm and watched in amazement as the dead reptile kicked and squirmed on her skin. The poor, terrified girl was reported to have nightmares after that of dead frogs coming to life. All these reports and observations can still be found today in the archives of the day's prominent medical journals, dated February 1846. By March, however, the skeptics got a hold of those journal articles. They also made the trek to Paris to see the electric girl for themselves. To say the least, they were underwhelmed, writing they, quote, witnessed no repulsive agency on a table or a similar object and saw no effect produced by the girl's arm on a magnetic needle, unquote. In short, they labeled 12-year-old Angelique a fraud. There's no record as to how Angelique thought about her sudden loss of ability. Perhaps it was a little relief. As to the reason her electrical power dissipated, one doctor theorized that, at 12 years old, turning 13, Angelique had simply undergone puberty, and this change had somehow manifested by making her just like everyone else again.
On a winter morning in rural Montana, the Anderson family kept their curtains drawn and their heating system running higher than most neighbors could tolerate. While others bundled in coats to shovel snow or ice fish on the frozen river, the Andersons stayed inside. For them, even a draft of cold air through a doorway could cause a storm of symptoms. Rashes that looked like burns, fevers that spiked within hours, aching joints, and eyes that swelled with redness. At first, doctors thought it was a simple case of cold urticaria, a condition where exposure to cold air or water triggers hives. but the pattern was deeper. Whenever the Anderson children played outside, even for a short while in the snow, they didn't just break out in welts. They developed fevers, chills, and exhaustion, sometimes needing days to recover. A genesis eventually unraveled the mystery. The family carried a mutation in the NLRP3 gene, which regulates the body's inflammasome, a microscopic alarm system that detects danger. In most people, cold weather might cause discomfort, but not illness. In the Andersons, however, the mutated gene set the immune system into overdrive whenever temperatures drop, unleashing floods of IL-1 beta, a powerful inflammatory chemical. Their condition had a name, familial cold autoinflammatory syndrome, also known as FCAS. The family story echoed others around the world. In Italy, certain families were discovered to have different mutations in NLRP12, leading to similar attacks of fever and rash when the cold settled in. In the United States, a few children were diagnosed with mutations in the PLCG2, a gene controlling immune cell signaling. These children developed hives from just touching a chilled soda can or stepping into an air-conditioned room. Their condition was given a new name, Plaid syndrome. It reflects this triad of cold urticaria, antibody deficiencies, and autoimmune problems. For generations, families with these mutations lived with their allergy to winter in silence, avoiding icy lakes, refrigerated food aisles, or even cool winds on spring evenings. In past centuries, they were seen as fragile, prone to fevers, or simply delicate. But in the early 2000s, science finally traced the culprit to specific stretches of DNA. Today, their stories are changing. For some IL-1 blocking drugs like anakinra or canakinumab have transformed daily lives, silencing the runaway alarm bells of the immune system. For others, careful management and strict avoidance remain the only path. The Anderson children grew up knowing they were different. While classmates played in the snow, they learned to watch from the window. Yet, armed with treatments and understanding, they began to imagine futures that weren't bound by fear of the cold. For them, the mutation that made winter dangerous also became a story of resilience, science, and the fragile line between adaptation and illness written in the human genome.
From Mississippi to Europe, Poland specifically, in the same year as Walter Williams, 2014, but later in that year, November 6th to be exact. A 91-year-old woman named Janina Kokovic, who lived in the small town of Ostro-Lubysky, was thought to be dead when she stopped breathing, her heart stopped beating, she had no pulse, and she had no movement in her pupils. Her niece called the doctor, who examined her and declared her dead, and then her body was sent to the funeral home to begin the embalming process. Only 11 hours later, the funeral home called her doctor to say that Kokovic was very much alive and had been lying in a body bag in a cold storage room. Her doctor, who declared her dead, Dr. Sławos, said, quote, "I was sure she was dead." She went on to say, "I'm stunned. I don't understand what happened. Her heart had stopped beating. She was no longer breathing. If I had my doubts, I would have called an ambulance, done an electrocardiogram, but I was sure that the patient is dead." There's no theory for what exactly happened to Kokovic that day, but there was an investigation into the matter as to why she was left in the cold storage room. The results of that investigation could not be found online. However, Kokovic didn't seem to be fazed by the incident. Apparently, when they opened her body bag, she told them she was cold and would like a cup of tea. A very reasonable response given everything that happened to her. Apart from that, she said she felt fine. It was also reported that she had late-stage dementia, so she was not fully aware of the events that had befallen her. The only problem was that, because she was declared dead, she could not continue to receive her pension. Government officials had to make sure her death declaration was reversed for her to continue receiving it. One would think that coming back from the dead would call for a fancy meal. But when she got home, she had a bowl of soup and 2 pancakes. We hope she enjoyed it. It's unknown what happened to Janina Kokovic after she was resurrected, but if she's still alive today, she'd be 100 years old. Kazan is a city in Russia, and in 2011, it had a population of about 1.1 million people. It was home to 49-year-old Fagila Mohammadzhanov and her 51-year-old husband, Fagil. In June 2011, Fagiliu had a heart attack and she was pronounced dead. Her body was given to her family and they hosted a funeral. As she lay in her coffin, her friends and family gathered around and started praying for her soul to make it to heaven. Then her eyelids started to flutter and suddenly she started screaming. Her friends and family were stunned and rushed her to the hospital. But it turned out that the shock of discovering that she was at her own funeral caused her to have another heart attack. She died about 12 minutes after she came back to life, meaning she had a fatal heart attack at her own funeral. Kim Noble was born in 1960 in the United Kingdom. She does not have a great recollection of what happened to her in her youth that caused such extreme trauma for her to develop DID. She says she doesn't want to know because whatever it is, it'll be upsetting, so she prefers not to think about it. What she does know is that her parents were factory workers and she was often looked after by other people. She believes she suffered abuse between the ages of 1 and 3. As a teenager, she dealt with a lot of hardship. She overdosed and she was sent to a psychiatric hospital. She developed both anorexia and bulimia. As an adult, she had many stays in a psychiatric hospital. She was given other diagnoses during these stays. When she was 20, she realized other personalities were emerging. At times, the personalities could be dangerous. For about 5 years, she had a job driving a van. Then one day, as she was driving, one of her other personalities, Julia, took over, and she drove the van into a line of parked cars. After that, she was hospitalized yet again. This time, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. After she was released, one of her personalities, Haley, witnessed the filming of child sexual abuse material by members of a pedophile ring. Haley reported them to the police. She was threatened, and then she was the victim of intense violence. She said that a man threw acid in her face. Then someone set her bed on fire while she was in the bed. She managed to escape, but her home was destroyed. Kim said that she didn't know anything about Haley's activities. In 1995, Kim was diagnosed with DID and things started to make more sense. She started going to therapy twice a week and many people in her life helped her. She has many different personalities, but there are varying accounts of how many personalities there are. According to her 2012 memoir, All of Me, How I Learned to Live with My Many Personalities Sharing My Body, she has more than 20. When she was interviewed in 2011 for The Guardian, she said she had up to 100. To help with her DID, Kim started doing art therapy. Many of her personalities like to paint. They have different styles in their art. Her personalities include Patricia, who is the current dominant personality. She's organized and makes sure things like the bills are paid. She also ensures that their daughter, Amy, has what she needs. Bonnie was the dominant and most responsible personality before Patricia. Then there's Judy, who is 15 and has bulimia. Salome is a devout Catholic. There is also Ken, a gay man who suffers from depression. One personality, Rhea Pratt, is a 12-year-old girl. Based on Rhea's artwork, she seems to be the one most in tune with the trauma Kim dealt with in her early life. Rhea's art is much more disturbing and shocking than the other personalities. Patricia says she sees Kim's experiences through Rhea's art. As previously mentioned, Kim has a daughter named Amy. The personality Dawn was the dominant personality at the time of Amy's birth. Kim lost custody of her daughter immediately after her birth. After that, Dawn had to step back and no longer be the dominant personality. The loss of Amy was tough for Kim to deal with. However, she managed to get her back after taking her case to the High Court. It was determined that Kim and her other personalities weren't a danger to Amy. Kim and her personalities raised Amy. Amy had many positive things to say about growing up with her mother. The personalities don't know what the others are doing when they are in control. They communicate with their therapist via email. They all have their own accounts and passwords. The personalities don't know each other's passwords. Also, Kim's personality doesn't really exist anymore. Patricia says that Kim is just the body and the other personalities inhabit it, but they do answer to the name Kim. In Kim's memoirs, she wrote that she does not want her personalities to integrate. She prefers to keep them separate because her life has been working well. The psychotherapist who worked with Kim, Dr. Valerie Sineson, said that DID is, quote, a brilliantly creative survival device, unquote. The success of Kim Noble's life and her happy relationship with her daughter show that people with DID can live full and happy lives. In the quiet corners of the world, there are people whose bodies move in ways that defy expectation. They reach for a cup with their right hand, and, as if guided by an invisible puppeteer, their left hand follows in perfect synchrony. Not by choice, not by imitation, but by relentless symmetry in their own biology. These are the mirror movement people. For most children, silent mirror movements are a normal part of development. A toddler learning to wave might inadvertently mirror the motion on the other side. But in a small number of families worldwide, these involuntary movements never fade. By age 10, when most children have gained full independent control of each limb, these individuals continue to experience their body betraying them, moving in mirrored unison. Doctors call this rare condition congenital mirror movement disorder, or CMM. To the outside world, it may seem like a minor quirk, but to those affected, it's a lifetime of adaptation, frustration, and remarkable resilience. The disorder often runs in families, carried silently in the DNA, ready to emerge in one child after another. The inheritance is typically autosomal dominant, meaning only one copy of the altered gene is needed for the condition to appear. Sometimes the genetic trail is more complex, weaving generations like a hidden signature. In one family, the father and 3 of his children all show the mirrored movements. The children cannot write long passages without their hands interfering with each other. One son, a talented pianist, must painstakingly retrain his brain and fingers to play each hand independently. Even everyday tasks like cutting vegetables, typing, or using tools require careful attention and innovative adaptation. The roots of these movements lie in the neural wiring of the brain. Normally, the motor cortex of each hemisphere communicates with the opposite side of the body. When you move your right hand, signals cross the spinal cord from the left side of your brain and activate only the right hand's muscles. In mirror movement people, these connections are partly uncrossed. Signals meant for the right hand also spill over, unintentionally instructing the left hand to mimic the motion. Genetic studies have identified several genes responsible for this miswiring. The gene is known as deleted in colorectal carcinoma, also known as DCC. These errors in this gene disrupt the proper crossing of motor signals in the spinal cord. Another gene is Netrin-1. This gene works alongside DCC in guiding axons. Mutations can exacerbate mirroring. Plus is RAD51. The gene mutation affects DNA repair mechanisms, indirectly influencing neural development and connection fidelity. These mutations are subtle yet powerful, sculpting a lifelong echo of every movement. Despite the challenges, the mirror movement people adapt. Children often invent personal strategies like using their body's mirrored behavior creatively or focusing on activities that do not demand independent bimanual coordination. Adults may become skilled in tasks that allow mirroring to enhance rather than hinder. Some artists and musicians use it to produce symmetric patterns in their work. Educational support is crucial. Teachers learn to accommodate extra time for writing assignments, and workplaces sometimes modify tasks to reduce frustration. In one documented family, siblings would sit together at the piano, each struggling with mirrored hands, learning patience, persistence, and a form of intimacy that only shared challenges can create. Parents recount the frustration of homework that takes twice as long, but also the joy of creative adaptations. One mother said, quote, "It's like our hands are talking to each other. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they dance together," unquote. These stories illustrate more than a medical curiosity. They reflect the human ability to navigate life with constraints written into the very neurons of the brain. Genetic counseling allows families to understand inheritance patterns and prepare for the future. While there is currently no cure for CMM, research into DCC, NTN1, and RAD51 genes is providing insight into how the nervous system wires itself, potentially paving the way for therapies that can minimize involuntary mirroring in the future. If you're familiar with The Last of Us, then it's likely that a bloater or a runner has haunted your dreams more than once. And believe it or not, the zombie outbreak of The Last of Us was based on a real method in which ants are zombified. Ants are zombified by fungus, and in this case, it wouldn't be a fungi. Get it? Fungi? Okay, bad joke. Back to the facts. The fungus is called cordyceps. This is how it works. Basically, the ant comes into contact with the fungus, which is called a fungal spore. The ant probably doesn't even notice, and that's the creepiest part of the whole thing. The fungus seeps into the ant and begins to grow. And this fungus is smart. It pushes into the ant's muscles. The fungus isn't only physical, it also sends a message to the brain, which forces the ant to leave the nest. Then, find a nearby plant and climb it. Then the ant bites down on the leaf, causing its jaw to lock, and then the ant dies. But the fungus isn't done yet. Not only is the dead ant stuck on the leaf, but a stalk emerges from the ant's head and releases spores on the ground. I know what you're wondering. Why does the location matter? And why would it keep the ant alive all that time? Well, the fungus may not be a fun guy, but it is a smart guy. Ants live in colonies, and if an ant shows signs that they're not well, the rest of the ants will attack it. They do so to avoid spreading disease or illness to the rest of the colony. So in order to infect as many ants as possible, the ant has to show no signs of illness while the fungus grows inside of it. Then it has to leave once it shows signs of illness. So the fungus has figured out a way to grow inside the ant and then kill off the ant when it's done with the ant's body. However, the fungus has found a way to live beyond the ant's body by spreading the spores after the ant dies. Interestingly, some scientists are trying to grow cordyceps. We're sure you're wondering what we're wondering. Why? Well, it turns out that although it can turn ants into zombies, it also has medicinal and healing properties. Scientists are looking at cordyceps to see how it would work as an antiviral medication, how it could fight cancer, and even help with COVID-19. And this is not the only time zombification in nature can serve medical needs. Two other fungi that are being researched are called Strongwell C. trignea and Strongwell C. erosia, and they infect the fly species called Ceranosia trignea, and Ceranosia testicea. The fungus, in this case, eats the fly's abdomen. However, as the fungus grows inside the fly continues to fly around. While the flies continue with their business, the fungus creates orange spores that follow the holes in the abdomen. The fly survives for days and spreads the fungus around, inevitably infecting other flies. So much like the ants releasing spores after their death, the fly continuously releases spores while it's still alive and flying around. This allows maximal fungal spread. The zombie fly doesn't even realize that their body has been taken over for nefarious purposes. However, this fungus can also be studied to see how it can be used medically. Researchers have found that the holes in the abdomen aren't infected by other pathogens during the period the fly is still alive and moving. This has led researchers to hypothesize that this fungus may have antimicrobial properties. So maybe there's something we can use for good from zombifying fungus. The good news is that none of these potential zombie outbreaks that appear in nature have already seen a jump to humans. And the other good news is that some of the fungi that have the ability to zombify insects also may serve human medical needs. The bad news is who knows what's going to happen. We're not saying a zombie outbreak is absolutely going to happen. We're just saying that when we played The Last of Us, not knowing it was based on a real thing, we found relief in thinking it was all made up. Now that we know there exists a basis in reality for all these potential outbreaks, even though they haven't quite made the leap to humans, we're definitely more freaked out than we ever were before. Take whatever you want from this video. We guess and hope that rabies don't go airborne, that prions don't connect to an established illness, and that these fungi serve good for humanity rather than inhibiting us to spread spores. Kazan is a city in Russia, and in 2011 it had a population of about 1.1 million people. It was home to 49-year-old Fagila Mohammed-Zanov and her 51-year-old husband, Fagil. In June 2011, Fagilyu had a heart attack and she was pronounced dead. Her body was given to her family and they hosted a funeral. As she lay in her coffin, her friends and family gathered around and started praying for her soul to make it to heaven. Then her eyelids started to flutter and suddenly she started screaming. Her friends and family were stunned and rushed her to the hospital. But it turned out that the shock of discovering that she was at her own funeral caused her to have another heart attack. She died about 12 minutes after she came back to life, meaning she had a fatal heart attack at her own funeral. Livonia and Lovelda Rowe, or Livonia and Lovelda Rowe Richmond, because their married names are the same too, because yes, they married twin brothers, were born in 1933. The twins they married are Arthur Richmond, who married Lovelda, and his brother, Alwyn Richmond, who married Livonia. So, they're really into the twin thing, but they have good reason to be. Livonia and Lovelda are identical mirror image twins. They have the exact same medical history. They've had the same illnesses and operations. They each have a weak eye, but it's the opposite eye from each other, and they have identical cavities, but they have them on the opposite sides of their mouths. They were so in sync with their health that if one got sick, the other would go get checked out just in case. This set of twins is very famous and have participated in many scientific experiments. In an experiment of 300 twins, they had the most extrasensory perception, which you may know as ESP. So while it may be difficult to understand how they were able to communicate in that way, it seems that there is some scientific basis for their ability to do so. Interestingly, with ESP, it turns out that one person in the set is a receiver and the other is the sender. For the Rowe Richmond sisters, Livonia is the receiver and Lovelda is the sender. One situation that demonstrates this is when Lovelda, the sender, fell down the stairs at school. They took her to the hospital, and someone went to tell Livonia, the receiver, what happened. When they found Livonia, she was unconscious. However, another, much more major incident occurred in 1952. Lavelda, again, this is a reminder that she's the sender, was on a date with a young man. They were in his car, and Lavelda's date took an unexpected turn and started driving in the wrong direction of the place where they were supposed to have their date. Lavelda understandably became concerned. Suddenly, the car skidded off the street. Lavelda was worried about what people would say to Livonia should something happen to her. The twins believe in that moment, when Lavelda thought about how Livonia would feel, Livonia got a sense that something was wrong. Livonia told her father that Lavelda was in danger, but he didn't believe her. He suspected that Livonia may have been feeling envious or left out that Lavelda was on a date without her. However, Livonia had reason to worry, because when the car skidded off the road, it ended up almost falling into a ravine, and Livonia hit her head on the dashboard. Lavelda said, in her head, she saw the accident as it was happening. Livonia was rescued by a farmer who towed the car away from the edge of the ravine and back onto the road, and they dropped Livonia off at home. Seeing that Lavelda was right about Livonia being in danger, their father asked Lavelda not to talk to Livonia and to show him the location of the car accident. And yep, you guessed it, Lavelda found the location, a place she had never been to before. Their father never doubted their psychic twin abilities ever again. There is one difference, though, in their medical history. Lavelda died at age 75 in 2009, and Livonia died at 86 in 2019. However, there's so much to indicate that there was, if nothing else, an extremely strong connection between the two women, and that a slight gap in their deaths shouldn't eradicate the rest of their history. So, what do you think? Did these three sets of twins convince you of the ability of twins to communicate with their minds? Or are all these simply coincidences or the result of a strong emotional connection between close siblings? In the early 1800s, the mountains of eastern Kentucky were wild, isolated, and almost unreachable to the outside world. Narrow creeks wound through steep hollows, and small clusters of settlers carved lives out of the dense Appalachian forest. Among these pioneers was Martin Fugate, a French orphan who crossed the Atlantic to find a new start. He sailed along a branch of the Kentucky River called Troublesome Creek, a place whose very name suggested hardship. Martin took as his wife a woman named Elizabeth Smith, whose complexion was unusually pale. What neither of them could have known was that they both carried a rare recessive gene, one that would pass quietly through their blood, reveal itself in an extraordinary way. When the children were born, 4 of them emerged with skin tinted a startling shade of blue. Not the faint duskiness of cold fingers, but a blue cast that spread across their entire bodies. Locals whispered about it, wondering if the family had been cursed. In truth, it was a medical condition known as hereditary methahemoglobinemia, though science would not catch up with the explanation for more than a century. Life on Troublesome Creek was difficult and lonely. Roads were few, travel was slow, and the families tended to stay within a few miles of one another. The Fugates, like most mountain settlers, married into nearby clans. The Combs, Stacys, Richies, and Smiths were families in the area. This intermarriage kept the rare blue-skin gene concentrated in the community so that generation after generation, children continued to be born with the same unusual coloring. The mountain folk grew accustomed to the sight. Blue men and women worked in the land, cut timber, attended church, and married like anyone else. The condition, aside from the striking skin, caused few health problems. The Fugates themselves were said to be strong, long-lived people. Still, their appearance earned them stares and whispers whenever they ventured outside their secluded hollows. By the mid-1800s, the family had grown into a sizable clan, with blue-skin relatives scattered across Breathitt and Perry counties. By the early 20th century, the Fugates were local legends. Outsiders who came into the region were startled by the sight of whole families tinted blue. Stories spread through Kentucky and beyond, often exaggerated or mocking. To the people of Troublesome Creek, though, the blueskin was simply part of their history. It wasn't until the 1960s that modern medicine finally intersected with the Fugates mystery. A young hermetologist named Dr. Madison Caldwell III at the University of Kentucky heard rumors of the Blue People and set out to find them. Together with the nurse, Ruth Prendergast, he tracked down several family members still living near Hazard and Troublesome Creek. When Dr. Caldwell examined them, he discovered that their blood had unusually high levels of methaglobin, a form of hemoglobin that cannot carry oxygen efficiently. Normally, an enzyme in the blood, diaphorease, converts it back to usable hemoglobin. But in the Fugates, a genetic deficiency led the methaglobin to accumulate, giving their skin its unusual blue cast. Dr. Caldwell tested a treatment almost by accident. He gave one of the Fugates methylene blue, a compound that acted as a chemical shortcut for the missing enzyme. Within minutes, the patient's skin flushed pink for the first time in his life. The effect was temporary, lasting a day or two, but pills could maintain the appearance of normal skin. For the Fugates, it was nothing short of a miracle. Many of them, though comfortable with their own identity, had grown weary of curious looks and cruel nicknames. Now they could choose whether to live visibly blue or quietly blend into society. Caldwell documented his findings in 1964 in the archives of internal medicine, solving a mystery that had puzzled generations of Appalachian families. As the 20th century progressed, roads reached Kentucky mountains, young people moved away, and the once-tight gene pool widened as the Fugates and their descendants married outsiders. The blueskin grew rarer and rarer. In 1975, a baby boy named Benjamin Benji Stacy was born in a hospital near Hazard. Nurses were shocked. His skin was as blue as a lake in summer. Fearing a medical emergency, they rushed him to Lexington, where doctors prepared for the worst. But the grandmother calmed them down, explaining, quote, "You don't need to do that. He's a Fugate," unquote. Benji's blue tint faded within weeks, leaving only a faint bluish hue in his lips and fingernails when he grew cold or angry. He became the last documented descendant born with the family's odd coloring. Today, the story of the Fugates has become legend, told in medical journals, in classrooms, and even in fiction. They are not remembered as a medical oddity, but as a testament to how isolation and heredity can shape human destiny. In early 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez of Riverside, California, received some terrible news. She was diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. On February 19, 1994, Ramirez was feeling confused. She had an irregular heartbeat and difficulty breathing. Over the previous few days, she had been nauseous and vomited several times. 911 was called, and first responders went to her home. She was placed in an ambulance and put on oxygen. She was transported to the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital. As the attending staff worked to stabilize her, they noticed an unusual oily sheen covering her body and a fruity garlic-like odor emanating from her mouth. A registered nurse, Susan Kane, drew some blood from Ramirez's arm. She noticed a chemical smell. She passed the tube with the blood in it to medical resident Julie Gonchinsky. Gonchinsky saw manila-colored particles in the blood. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch also smelled the chemical odor. She described it as similar to ammonia. She thought it was coming from the syringe. Suddenly, Susan Kane fainted. Then Julie Gonichewski started to feel lightheaded. She went to the nurse's station, where she also fainted. Then Maureen Welch fainted. Other staff members got sick, and the emergency room had to be evacuated. Minimal staff remained to work on Ramirez, but she died about an hour after arriving at the hospital. Out of the 37 employees working that day, 23 fell ill. 6 had to be hospitalized. 5 were released the next day. Julie Gonichewski was the worst off. She spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. She had tremors and apnea. She also suffered with hepatitis, pancreatitis, and avascular neurosis in her knees. Avascular neurosis is a serious medical condition in which bone tissue is deprived of its blood supply, causing it to die. 2 months after the incident, Gonichewski had surgery on her knees. In the media, Gloria Ramirez was labeled the toxic woman. An autopsy was performed and no toxins were found in her body. Also, no toxins were found in the hospital's plumbing or ventilation system. Ramirez had died of kidney failure as a result of her cervical cancer. But what made her blood so toxic that it hospitalized 6 medical professionals and made 17 others ill? Some thought it was a case of mass hysteria. But people like Julie Gonichewski do not believe this. The leading theory involves a chemical called dimethyl-foxide, also known as DMSO. DMSO is often utilized for its anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. It's also made naturally in the body. Ramirez had DMSO levels that were 3 times higher than usual. It's believed that Ramirez was treating herself with DMSO because of her cervical cancer. She may have covered her body with DMSO cream before she died. This would explain the oily sheen on her body. Hospital workers also noted a garlic smell emanating from her mouth. When DMSO metabolizes in the body, it can cause the person to have garlicky breath. DMSO is usually not toxic, but there was a chemical conversion in Ramirez's body when she was given oxygen in the ambulance. When one oxygen atom is added to DMSO, it becomes dimethyl sulfate, a highly toxic substance that can cause severe irritation to the eyes, skin, and respiratory tract. In larger doses, it can cause systemic toxicity, leading to organ damage, and is possibly fatal. Many of these are the symptoms that the hospital staff experienced. However, Ramirez's family claimed she did not use DMSO. They believe the hospital is responsible for the toxic event. The 2 previous cases show that people with DID can live full lives and are non-threatening individuals. However, the case of Billy Milligan is much different. Billy was born William Stanley Morrison on February 14, 1955, to Dorothy and Johnny Morrison. Billy had 2 siblings. Their father, Johnny, ended up taking his own life, and this led to Dorothy moving the family around. The family eventually settled in Lancaster, Ohio. On October 27, 1963, Dorothy married Chalmer Milligan. Chalmer adopted Dorothy's children, and they took on the name Milligan. Billy claimed that his stepfather sexually and physically abused him from a young age. While family members have corroborated the allegations, Billy's stepfather always denied it. Experts believe this is why Billy developed DID. However, there are some questions as to whether Billy had DID before living with his stepfather, since some of his personalities appeared around the age of 5, and his stepfather didn't come into his life until he was at least 6 years old. Billy had a difficult childhood. When he was a teenager, he was committed to a psychiatric facility. He was diagnosed with a condition that was referred to at the time as hysterical neurosis, but he was expelled from the hospital after a short stay because of behavior issues. This trend continued when he was expelled from high school and then subsequently dismissed from the Navy after joining in 1972. Shortly after his stint in the Navy, Billy's behavior became much darker. The same year he was dismissed from the Navy, he was convicted of rape, kidnap, and assault. As a result, he spent 6 months in a youth camp in Zanesville, Ohio. But his troubles didn't end there. In 1975, Billy was arrested again, and this time he was sentenced to time in prison for rape and armed robbery. He was released on parole 2 years later, in 1977. He was soon arrested again, this time for the rape of 3 women on the Ohio State University campus, and this is how he earned the moniker, the campus rapist. Before his trial, he underwent a psychological examination performed by Dr. Willis C. Driscoll. Dr. Driscoll diagnosed Billy with schizophrenia. Then Dr. Dorothy Turner did her evaluation and diagnosed him with dissociative identity disorder. Billy's lawyers decided to plead insanity. Some comments made by his victims did seem to support the diagnosis. The women he raped said during the assaults, Billy gave them different names and his voice changed. Sometimes he spoke with different accents. There was also odd shifts in his behavior. The Ohio Police Investigation Supervisor, Elliot Boxerbaum, noticed that Milligan seemed to be inhabited by different people. He said, quote, "I couldn't tell you what was happening, but it felt like I was talking to different people at different times," unquote. Billy said that he often lost time. After he came out of the blackout, he was usually in trouble. This suggests he was unaware what his other personalities were doing and had no control over their actions. When he was back in charge, he was dealing with the repercussions of the actions of the other personalities. However, not everyone is convinced that the disorder is real. This includes Professor of Psychiatry Thomas Azaz, who said, quote, "Multiple personality is just a figure of speech. It's nothing but a hoax," unquote. Even today, using DID in a trial as part of an insanity defense is very difficult. Dr. Dorothy Otnow Lewis, who is a psychiatrist with expertise in DID, says there's no medical test or technology that will prove without a doubt that person is living with DID. Dr. Lewis says the defense needs to provide other evidence like drawings and handwriting samples. 23-year-old Billy Milligan's trial for the 3 rapes was just one day. There was no jury, and it was to be decided by a judge. There was no doubt that Billy, or at least his physical body, committed the rapes, but the defense claimed that one of his other personalities committed the rapes. The judge had to determine whether Billy could be held accountable for the offenses that were committed by another personality. The defense had several psychiatrists testify. Billy was found not guilty by reason of insanity on December 4, 1978. He was the first defendant in U.S. history to use DID as a defense and to be found not guilty. However, Billy wasn't allowed to roam free. He ended up spending the next 10 years in state-run psychiatric hospitals. When he entered the facility, he had 10 personalities. One was Reagan, who Billy said was an evil personality. He was Yugoslavian and a communist. Billy blamed him for the robberies he had been convicted of. He said that Reagan felt like he was acting like Robin Hood. Arthur was British and interested in topics like science and medicine. Then there was Alan, who was manipulative. Tommy was into technology and had been called an escape artist. Alana was a 19-year-old lesbian. This personality was described as shy, and she enjoyed activities like cooking. She was the one who supposedly raped the women. She did it because she wanted to feel close to them. During his treatment, psychiatrist David Call wanted to integrate Billy's personalities. but the opposite happened. Over the time at the facility, Billy developed 14 more personalities. Some of the personalities were considered security risks and called undesirables. This led to Billy being sent to the Lima State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in 1980. Billy despised the hospital and called it a chamber of horrors. He hated it so much that in July 1986 he escaped. He went to the Columbus, Ohio bus station. At the bus station, he left a videotape he had recorded of himself. He explained that he escaped because he feared for his life. His escape was him acting in self-defense. Billy made his way to Bellingham, Washington. He lived under the name Christopher Carr. In Bellingham, he had a roommate, 32-year-old Michael Madden. In September 1986, Madden went missing. Billy sold Madden's car a few days after he went missing. Billy also set up a P.O. box in Madden's name and redirected Madden's mail there. He cashed Madden's pension and GI Bill checks. Michael Madden has never been found. It's believed that he was a victim of foul play. After nearly 4 months on the lam, Billy Milligan was recaptured in Miami, Florida in November 1988. He had some of Madden's possessions. Billy was questioned by the police regarding Madden's disappearance. He gave conflicting stories about what happened to him. Billy is the prime suspect in Michael Madden's murder, but he was never charged. Billy was brought back to the hospital. He was ultimately released in 1988. The doctors believed his personalities had fused and he was not a risk to society. He was under the state's mental health supervision until 1991. That was the last time he was under any type of supervision. Billy moved to California, lived there for a while, and then returned to Ohio. Billy Milligan was diagnosed with cancer in 2012, and he died on December 12, 2014, at the age of 59, in a nursing home in Columbus, Ohio. Billy's life has been the basis and inspired several pieces of media. Daniel Keyes, award-winning author of Flowers for Algernon, published The Minds of Billy Milligan in 1981. Billy's case inspired the 2016 M. Night Shyamalan film, Split. In 2021, Netflix released a documentary series called Monster Inside: The 24 Faces of Billy Milligan. Finally, the 2023 Apple series starring Tom Holland, The Crowded Room, is based on Billy Milligan. On the very cold night of December 20th, 1980, 19-year-old Jean Hillard was driving back to her parents' home in Langby, Minnesota. While driving down a country road, her car slid off the road and became stuck in a ditch. Trying to get the car back on the road only caused the vehicle to fall deeper into the ditch. While sitting there, Hillard ran a few options through her head. She thought if she stayed in the car with it running, she would suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning, or someone who came across her while she was alone could harm her. Being on a country road, she also feared that no one would come for her for a long time. Knowing a friend's house just down the road, Hillard decided to walk back there and get help. It was a decision she would later regret. That night in Minnesota, the weather was about 30 degrees below Celsius with a wind chill factor of minus 20 degrees Celsius. That's about minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 7 degrees Fahrenheit. She was only dressed in a thin sweater, parka, jeans, and cowboy boots. She did not have a hat or a hood. Hillard set out towards her friend's house, feeling the cold, but she wasn't worried because she was used to the cold weather. Not knowing how far she was from her friend's house, the cold weather slowed her down. She would walk up a hill and think the house would be there, but it wasn't. After an hour of walking, Hillard saw her friend's house through the trees. She had already walked about 2 miles. Relieved, Hillard headed towards the house, and that was the last thing she remembers. While walking towards the house, she said everything went black. Hillard stumbled to her hands and knees and tried crawling to the doorstep, but she lost consciousness. Just lying feet from the door of her friend Wally Nelson's home, she remained there in the snow for the next 6 hours. Nelson, who was Hillard's boyfriend's best friend, came out that morning to a surprise. Having hung out with Hillard and her boyfriend the night before, drinking and dancing at the Boston American Legion, Nelson was shocked to find her frozen stiff on his front lawn. Her face was pale, and her eyes were frozen wide open. He grabbed her by the collar and dragged her into his house. Thinking she was dead, he noticed bubbles coming out of her nose. He recruited the woman he brought home the night before to help him load Hillard into his truck. However, she was frozen solid, so they couldn't get her into the cab of his truck. So they had to load her into Nelson's overnight friend's car. He said it was a very awkward way to end the night. Nelson rushed her to the Boston hospital, where doctors were not optimistic. She was frozen solid and stiff as a wooden board. She also had frostbite all over her body. The nurses hooked her to the heart rate monitor and saw that she had a gonal rhythm. The nurses described it as one beat, then flat for a while, but it was a sign of life. Hillard's core temperature was 27 degrees Celsius, or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. A normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Her body was so frozen that they could not pierce it with a needle to start an IV. They broke a couple of needles trying. Because of the amount of frostbite on her body, doctors worried that her internal organs would suffer from hypothermia and they would have shut down. For them, the most optimistic outcome was that she would have brain damage or a double leg amputation. With a grim outlook, the doctors decided to warm up her body and try to do their best for survival. At this time, her pastor was called and told the unsettling news. The pastor started a prayer chain. After getting heating pads and wrapping Hillard in blankets, her body returned to normal in a couple of hours. 2 hours into defrosting, she went into violent spasms. Though it seemed scary, it was a good sign because it meant life was returning to her body. By the next morning, Hillard was awake. Despite doctors' fears, Hillard did not suffer any brain damage, and her legs remained on her body with no damage from frostbite. Coming back from being an ice block, her only worry was that her dad would be mad at her because she got the car stuck in the ditch. After 49 days in the hospital, Hillard was discharged with only some numb toes and blisters. Hillard's story became national news and she became somewhat of a minor celebrity. She toured local churches telling her story and how she believes prayer helped save her life. Talk shows had her on as a guest. She appeared on the Today Show and was interviewed by Tom Brokaw. Her story appeared on the February 9th, 1996 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. After her 15 minutes of fame, she returned to normal life. She got married and had 3 children. She later divorced and moved to Cambridge, Minnesota, where she works at Walmart. She says she kept waiting for something to happen to her medically after the accident, but reports no lingering health issues. However, now she bundles up and stays off the back roads on icy nights. So how did Hillard survive being frozen solid and return to life with no health issues? David Plummer, a professional of emergency medicine at the University of Minnesota, has somewhat of an explanation for Hillard's case. He says that as a person cools down, their blood flow slows and their body requires less oxygen. It's like a form of hibernation. If their blood flow increases at the same rate as their body warms up, they can often recover. Today, doctors have a special medical device that warms patients' blood in a heater, then pumps it back into them, warming up their vital organs. Although there is no guarantee of survival, this is the best chance of dealing with extreme hypothermia. In 1980, they did this with just heat pads and blankets, so Dr. Plummer is surprised and can't explain how Hillard recovered in such a small rural hospital and had no lasting health issues. But for Hillard, she claims it was the help of a prayer chain and a miracle. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.